cultural attractions, and other similar facilities for over 25 years now. And while my work of the last 10 years is mainly with sports teams and corporate entities, I still do museum-like work. I'm director of curation and collections management for the Illich companies. And the Illich companies cover the Detroit Tigers baseball team, the Detroit Red Wings hockey team, Little Caesars Pizza Corporate, 313 Presents Entertainment, and a number of other companies. And I spent many years at the Ali Center, which was the last thing I did before going to Detroit in 2015. And it was such a fun place to work out of. And also it was a privilege to be associated with, Muhammad's legacy. Over at the Ali Center, I headed up their education programs and their curation programs, as well as collections management. And doing education over there was just a lot of responsibilities, because you want to make sure that you do, the programming right related to the legacy of Muhammad Ali, but also represent his values, in the right way, and try to figure out how you bring that to life. So, quick question before we dig a little deeper. So, question for everybody: what do you know about Muhammad Ali?
His original name was Cassius Clay. He was ended up having difficulty with the army.
Yeah, and he changed his religion.
Yeah.
To Islam, I think Islam.
Yeah.
And then changed.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Brandy.
Okay. I think he had Parkinson's later, and it wasn't clear if it was the head injury from the boxing. I come from a family of doctors, so I think more about medical stuff.
No. So you guys are right on all of that. And it's great that you touched upon different facets of Muhammad's life. Muhammad Ali was born Cassius Clay in 1842. And in 1942, I'm sorry. And his mother worked part-time, his dad was a laborer, and they grew up, him and his younger brother, in a family of that was very modest, very humble. And as Muhammad grew up, at the age of 12, he had one of those events that changes people's lives completely. So a little bit before his 12th birthday, he got a red bicycle for Christmas. And that was just the most amazing thing for little Cassius, because now instead of going shopping on foot, he could use the bike. He could use the bike to get to his friends faster. That bike was everything for him. It was pretty fantastic. And it just so happens that a little later in 1954, so he turned 12 in January, and he had school. And at one point, I believe it was in the late spring, but don't quote me on that. It happened, during the year of him being 12. He went to do some groceries for his mom. And when he came out, somebody had stolen the bike. All right. And by the way, they grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. And somebody stole the bike. And little Cassius was livid. He started stomping the sidewalk, challenging anybody who stole his bike to come over. And he was just going to whoop him. And he made so much noise that it got the attention of a local policeman who admired the spirit of little Cassius Clay, but told him that you should quiet down, because the kind of people that steal bikes they wouldn't be getting a whooping from such a small and scrawny kid as he was. But Cassius was determined, and the policeman had an idea, based on the spirit of what Cassius was showing. He walked him over to a nearby boxing club where that policeman was actually one of the coaches there. And he just thought that little Cassius would be the kind of kid that would really benefit from learning to box, learning to fight. For one thing, to focus that aggressivity into something else than people, and learn some skills and learn some discipline. And also, if ever he would have to whoop somebody, he'd be able to, because clearly he wasn't in any kind of shape to do that. So this is what at the Ali Center we used to call the red bicycle story. One of those turning points in life that nobody can foresee. Nobody could have guessed that his bike would have been stolen, or that he would have met a policeman that would have introduced him to boxing. What a coincidence, right? What a great story to one of the all-time, greatest boxers. So little Muhammad, little Cassius, he wasn't Muhammad just yet, went through school and worked on boxing. And not only did he show some talent, he worked really hard at that. And by the time he finished high school, he'd won enough tournaments that he actually qualified for the U.S. boxing team for the Rome Olympics in 1960. And despite the fact that he was terrified of the idea of airplanes, he talked himself into being able to get on the plane, because obviously taking a transatlantic ship across was not anything the Atlantic Committee was going to pay for this single kid. But Muhammad made it to the Rome Olympic Games in 1960, competed as a light heavyweight, and won the gold medal. So that was a second huge turning point for in the life of Cassius Clay. Won the gold medal, and it did it in a very dominant way. His wins were very solid, nothing controversial. He just was the cream of the crop at his in his weight category. So when he came back to Louisville, he had a little bit of celebrity there. Louisville is not New York or Los Angeles or Chicago. They didn't have that many gold medal winners. So when he came back, he really got celebrated, and in fact given the keys to the city and recognized everywhere. But let's still remember that this was 1960 in the South. And while Kentucky plays a particularly sensitive spot, geographically, Kentucky is kind of the south of the North and north of the South. Still, Kentucky was having some significant racial issues, as most of you are familiar in Region 5, while things went really well for him because he was considered a little bit of a local hero, he was heartbroken by the treatment that his friends and family would get. And there's an interesting story around the fact that at one point he wanted to go to lunch with one of his buddies, and they stepped into a restaurant, and Muhammad was there just with his friend. And essentially somebody came up to them and told, Cassius Clay that he was welcome to sit down for lunch, but they would not admit his friend. And that was a particularly hard moment for Muhammad. And legend has it that that restaurant was not too far away from a bridge crossing over the Ohio River. And Cassius was so angry with that situation and so embarrassed that he stormed over to the bridge and said that, if winning a gold medal and bringing attention to Louisville and doing everything he'd done did not make any difference, because of the color of his skin for anybody else who was black, then his gold medal was worthless. And he snatched the gold medal, which he'd been wearing every waking moment since he won it in Rome. He snatched the gold medal from his neck and threw it in the Ohio River. And nobody's found it. So this is one of those stories that's really hard to verify, but that's the lore of why Muhammad could never pull out the gold medal. He said he threw it away. He was very upset that day, and it was something that was very meaningful for him. As things would go, a little later, in 61, Muhammad started his professional career in earnest, and he had a very successful start to his professional career. So much so that a few years later, at a surprisingly young age, he was just 21 at that point, they put him up against the reigning heavyweight champion, Sonny Liston, who was an absolute terror. He was, similar to George Foreman in his early years, Mike Tyson in his early years, fighters that would take on newcomers, and literally nobody would last more than a couple of rounds. And almost every fight finished in a knockout. And Sonny Liston is still considered one of the scariest boxers of all time. He was a big guy. He had a high knockout ratio, and he just scared a lot of people. And Cassius Clay met him in his fight, and the fight was pretty even if it was a little more on Sonny Liston's edge. But as we hit the middle rounds, Muhammad's youth and speed started to catch up with Liston, and ultimately Muhammad won the fight by technical knockout. Liston could not come off, his bench, his stool, and Muhammad was, champion, and his national fame started from there. And it was very funny because right after the fight, he was interviewed. He was still ringside, and that was those were some of the early moments where you heard Muhammad say that he was the best. He was champion of the world, and he just could not be beat. And his championship reign started there. There was a rematch with Sonny Liston that next year, and while people were still afraid of Sonny Liston and were worried of what he would do to Muhammad, Muhammad Ali had no issues with him, and in fact knocked him out in the second round. And that cemented his legacy as a champion. By the way, after the first Liston fight, a couple days later, or the next day maybe, Muhammad announced that he had joined the Nation of Islam, which is part of Islam, but a sect of Islam. I'm not sure even to this day it's recognized as a formal part of Islam, or in what role it is. It's not like, Sunni Muslims and some of the big branches. It's really an outcrop, based on some of the key principles of Islam. And Muhammad joined the Nation of Islam, and as such, gave up what he called, or what he referred to as, a slave name of Cassius Clay, which is not an incorrect term, because the name Clay remained the last name of the family since for 5 generations, as they belong to a Mr. Clay. when the family was actually still under slavery. So that's in part why Muhammad referred to it like that. And it was a huge growth experience for a young kid from Louisville who had a high school education, but not much else and not much exposure to anything else apart from the Olympics and some of the public events that had brought him through fighting. And through the Nation of Islam, he met a lot of, people that influenced his life, including the late leader of the Nation of Islam, and perhaps even more important, Malcolm X, who for many years became a very close friend. And interestingly enough, to this day, certain members of the Malcolm X family are still very close to the Ali family. There was a connection there. Muhammad's career, went on and grew. There were in the mid-60s some controversy between Muhammad and Malcolm X. They kind of grew apart, and it's and ultimately Malcolm X had a tragic end under the bullets of assassins, as Malcolm himself was moving away from the Nation of Islam as such. And it's pretty well established that he was killed by members of the Nation of Islam. Muhammad continued with the Nation of Islam for several more years, but eventually left and joined the larger movements of Islam. But as Muhammad was defending his title through the years, a big moment came up in his life, and that's when he was drafted for the Vietnam War. And that was full of controversy, in part because there is some paperwork that he had been eliminated for educational and intellectual reasons at an earlier time. And it seems that decision was revised coming up on 1967, and he was drafted. And Muhammad objected to the war and refused to join the army, famously saying that he had no beef with the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese had never done anything to him. And part of it was also his objection to war as a member of Islam. So there were a number of reasons why Muhammad did not want to do that. It's not like he would have gone to the front lines. There are a number of examples of celebrities that have been that have been drafted or pulled into the armed forces. Joe Louis, the world famous boxer, 40 years, actually, sorry, about 25 years earlier, had been drafted, and Joe Louis, of course, never shot a gun. He was doing exhibits for fundraising, for entertainment for the troops. Elvis Presley was another example. There were many. So, it was clear that Muhammad would not be put on the front lines, but this was something of so important for Muhammad in terms of principle that he fought it, all the way, and it got him into a lot of trouble. He ended up missing out on 4 years of his boxing career at an age that he would have been at his best. And there was the threat of jail the whole time and huge fines, and he couldn't make any revenue from fighting anymore. So that was challenging, and it was very hard for him. And ultimately, his case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. There are many movies made of this, and it's a fascinating story, really. If you have any interest in Muhammad Ali, if you have any interest in the controversy around, the draft and his objection to the war and the Supreme Court case. It is absolutely fascinating. Be that as it may, the Supreme Court sided with Muhammad that he had a valid and justified objection to the war, and eliminated, the threat of prison, the threat of fine, and Muhammad could start fighting again. State commissions, now that he'd been cleared, would allow him to start some fights. And he got back in 1970 at the end of the year into a couple of fights to get him in shape for what would become one of the biggest fights of his life. So in 1971, he met the then heavyweight champion, Joe Frazier, who made his way to the top after Muhammad was stripped of his title. And Smoking Joe was a very good boxer in his own right, and is still considered to this day one of the great champions of the 20th century. And they had an epic fight that was broadcast on closed circuit TV across the US. Never had a sporting event been so spread throughout the US. And it ended up being the first time that fighters would get $1 million for a fight. Both Joe and Muhammad would get $1 million. First time ever it happened. And it was much needed in Muhammad's case because the previous 4 years had been particularly difficult. As things would go, Muhammad would suffer his first professional loss against Joe Frazier. It happened at the end of the fight, and Joe Frazier remained the champion, but it's still considered one of the greatest fights ever. And it allowed Muhammad to, get back into the fight game and start earning money. And he ended up doing very well over the next couple of years. He only had one loss to a boxer named Ken Norton. Ken Norton had a style that was particularly difficult for Muhammad. We all know in sports, sometimes you can have the best team out there, the best athlete, and there's like one kind of style that, shouldn't bother them, but it does. Ken Norton was that guy for Muhammad. But be that as it may, Muhammad positioned himself as the number one contender to fight in 1974, the reigning new champion of the heavyweight class, a young man by the name of George Foreman, who had terrified everybody and knocked out Joe Frazier in 2 rounds. So he was, and he was just, such a threat. And I think that George Foreman, at the time he met Muhammad, had won all but one of his 30-something fights by knockout. Just remarkable. But as things would go, Muhammad would actually upset George Foreman in Zaire, and Muhammad became champion again and kept his title until 77, where he lost it to Leon Spinks for 1 fight. He won it back later on, and then finished off his career, not necessarily in a very graceful way. Muhammad was a very generous man and gave away a lot of the money he earned from his fights, knowing that there'd be big fights coming up. But as Muhammad would later say, only Father Time is undefeated, and eventually age caught up with Muhammad and slowed down, wasn't as fast, wasn't as powerful, and ended up having 2 fights to finish off his career that really he should not have had. And his manager, Angelo Dundee, told him that he shouldn't. And after the thorough beating he got from from Holmes, who was at that time the new champion and was a great boxing champion. Very, very skilled individual. Muhammad retired, and shortly thereafter, it was stated that Muhammad had been hiding some symptoms from Angelo Dundee and others that were precursors to Parkinson's disease. So it came up on him very, very early. He was still in his 30s. He was still in his 30s when the first symptoms came on. After his boxing career was over, in addition to dealing with a growing impact of Parkinson in his life, Muhammad really changed a lot of things and dedicated himself to Islam a lot more. And um, as his religious dedication increased and his understanding of his potential role in the world increased, Muhammad got more involved in missionary work and got involved with the UN. And while he was no longer the active world champion, he was still one of the most recognized athletes in the world and one of the most famous people. Arguably, the two most famous individuals of the 20th century are Muhammad Ali and Winston Churchill. And Muhammad Ali wanted to do something meaningful with that. So he went around for fundraising to a variety of countries for events, bringing, spirit and hope where he could. And that became a very important part of who he was. And Muhammad would be the first one to tell you that if you're the same man at the age of 50 that you were when you were 20 years old, you've wasted 30 years of your life. And he really grew tremendously and was involved with initiatives until the end of his life, as difficult as it became, dealing with Parkinson's for, over 30 years, which is very, very rare. Now, Randy, you mentioned a little earlier that in reference to Parkinson, that, we didn't know whether it was the boxing, whether there was a genetic cause or anything. And you're right, it was never settled with certainty. But Muhammad never felt sorry for himself. And in my early years at the Ali Center, in fact, in my first year at the Ali Center, I was at a fundraiser for Parkinson's, where, of course, Lonnie Ali and Muhammad were present. And as part of that fundraiser, they had one of those big auction thing. Obviously people paid money to be there and be at the event, per plate. But there were also, things signed by Muhammad and practice gloves and worn trunks and a whole bunch of stuff to raise even more money. And a funny thing happened at that point that as people found out what item they won in the auction, they weren't supposed to, but somebody had won a pair of training shorts and went up to the table where Muhammad and Alani were and asked Muhammad to autograph the shorts. So back then in 2011, Muhammad Ali's signature was not really recognizable anymore after almost 30 years of Parkinson. But, it's a gesture. And as things would happen, once people saw that Muhammad would do that, to the great dismay of Lonnie and the security team, other people came up. So now you know it. They fix up a table and Muhammad's sitting behind the table and there's a line of people coming in to sign the items. And at one point, there's a young man in his late 20s that comes along and asks Muhammad to sign his item, but Muhammad signed it and shakily pushed it back to the young man, and the young man didn't react, and he was just standing there, and you could see the tears in his eyes, coming up. And he asked if he could go around and get closer to Muhammad, wanted to give him a hug or something. And the security team let him do that. And the young man went next to Muhammad, and he put his hand around his shoulder and brought down his head to his ear and said, "Champ, tell me, is it the punches that did this to you?" And Muhammad, who couldn't speak very well, even if it was one of those last events where he could actually put sentences together, motioned for the young man to lean back because his voice wasn't very strong. And he whispered in his ears, "Not the punches, all the autographs." So we don't know, but he had a grace about him. He had a sense of humor that was extraordinary, and he wanted his fame and his success and the challenges he had to be a lesson to everybody, and if it could make anybody's life better, if he could inspire anybody, he wanted to be that person. And we saw that at the Atlanta games. You guys remember when he lit the cauldron? He had the last torch for the Atlanta games, and it was such a moving moment. See him, even with the difficulties of Parkinson, and even in his late years, there was a radiance about him, even if he couldn't communicate very well. And over at the Ali Center, the Ali Center is really about, two major parts of his life. Of course, it's Muhammad the boxer. All right, you go to the Muhammad Ali Center, you'll be pretty disappointed if you don't have anything about his boxing career, right? Because it was such a glorious one, and he's still considered one of the great athletes of the 20th century. But there is the other half of the Ali Center, which is about his mission to make the world a better place, to inspire people, to give them hope, to make them think that they too can make a difference in this world. And one of the things we really worked on, there were 6 core values, 6 core principles that were really particularly meaningful to Muhammad. And those core values were confidence, conviction, dedication, giving, respect, and spirituality. You had to be confident. If you're not confident in who you are and what you're doing, learn it. If you can't learn it, you're going to have a really hard time making your way up in the world. Conviction, you got to believe in what you're doing. Don't believe in anything, but if you find something that's important, that's meaningful, that is worthwhile, then have the conviction of your beliefs and your thinking. Dedication, nothing will happen without dedication and hard work. You've got to put in the time. No, nothing will be given to you. In terms of giving back, Muhammad had this great quote that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that giving back to people around us is the rent we pay for our time here on earth. It's you got to give back. If you have the privilege and the luck and the benefit of having something, pass it on. Don't hoard it. Respect was very important for Muhammad, and you wouldn't think that it would have been from his boxing years, as he was insulting and trash talking everybody. But there was a fascinating interview with Howard Cosell. You guys remember Howard Cosell from the 70s and 80s? the greatest sport announcer of his time, and unique mannerism and a unique voice. And in 1980, Howard Cosell interviewed Muhammad Ali, and he said, Muhammad, why don't we hear you ranting and raving and screaming and insulting everybody like you used to? Here you are, later in your career, and you seem to have slowed down. And Muhammad, turned to him with a little smile and a twinkle in his eyes, and he said, Howard, when you become mayor of the city, you don't have to campaign anymore. And he got quieter over the years, but also, realized that respect for other people was really meaningful and important. And then spirituality. Spirituality was such an important part of Muhammad's life, and he dedicated so many years to that. And in part, I think that's what saw him through 35 years of Parkinson's and continuing to travel and continuing to meet up with people and raise funds and inspire hope. And there was a sense of, it doesn't matter what you believe in, but you got to believe in something. You got to believe in something bigger than yourself. You got to believe in something that, makes the world a better place. So those are really important, principles for Muhammad. And maybe just to, wrap up the story. The idea of a Muhammad Ali Center or of an Ali Center was in the works from the late 90s on. And there was a sense that Muhammad's life and his accomplishments and, the work he did was so meaningful that there was a group of people that didn't want this to be lost after his departure. So for about 10 or 15 years, there was talk about having a place that would, celebrate Muhammad and his life. And they didn't quite know what form it would take. And eventually it came in the form of a museum in his hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. And if you're familiar at all with Louisville, it's in a beautiful location. It's right off of 6th and Main Street. Sure, there's a highway nearby, but it's a 6-story building where you can see the Ohio River and across the river into Ohio. And there's a beautiful view of, Louisville. And the first floor is dedicated to sort of a biography of Muhammad and some of his early works. And then you've got more dedicated on the 5th floor to his boxing career. Then you go to the 4th floor, and that's where his missionary work and his spirituality is on display. And then the lower floors are for staff, the entrance, the retail store, ticketing. But they eventually settled on the model of a museum, and they opened it in 2005. And it was a huge success at the beginning, but it was challenging for the folks who opened it because none of them were really museum folks. And that was one of the reasons I was brought in 2010 and to bring some changes and some programming. And it's a nonprofit, so it was difficult to spend a lot of money. But since it was a nonprofit and we had limited funds, even with help from Lonnie and Mohammed, we didn't want them to sink all of their money into the center. One of the things we did was based on the principles of Muhammad, based on some of the vision to make this world a better place. We didn't try to do everything ourselves, but rather become a platform for others that had similar ideas. So we ended up having traveling exhibits that were meaningful that came We had movies that were inspirational. We had visits by the Dalai Lama and by other members of his close circle. And we just had, a great programming and a lot of event. And people came in, and even those who came in, angry that they'd been bullied to come to the Ali Center by family members because they thought that Muhammad was a draft dodger. And all they knew about him was that he was a boxer and dodged the draft. They left the center having a much deeper understanding of his life, the meaning of what he represented, and the stories around many parts of his life. So maybe the last thing that I'll leave you with, and excuse me, I'll take a couple of questions afterwards. Muhammad carried a poem from the time he was a teenager, literally to the end of his days, that always inspired him, and he went back to it very often. And that poem was the poem If by Rudyard Kipling. So if you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to Google the poem If by Kipling and take a look. It's not a very long poem, but very inspirational. And you can see how it would really impact a young Cassius Clay and then a young Muhammad. And he kept it despite becoming, a high-ranking member of the Nation of Islam. So I threw a lot of stuff at you over the last 40 minutes here. I hope there was some interesting things in there for you. Any questions that come up or?
Well, first of all, thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. Very thorough, too. I didn't realize, so much about him. I think we all knew little bits and pieces, but not as much as what you, presented. So,
How accurate was the movie?
Which one? There are a lot of movies.
Really, I'm talking about Ali with Smith. It really.
It was one of the movies that was better accepted by the family. All right. So no movie is an exact biography. There are always little parts that are changed for a number of reasons, but that effort and the movie around the Supreme Court decision are probably the two movies that are not documentary movies that are the most accurate. No, are we talking 90%, 95%? There's always a few embellishments here. And, honestly, in his young years, Muhammad went through 3 wives before going over to Lonnie. If you're going to make a movie that's 3-4 hours long, tough to spend enough time with the older man to really understand, how he regretted that and moved beyond that. So, some parts that may be a little more critical were diminished. But overall, the Smith movie was well accepted. And I would tell you that from a historical perspective, there are very few things we can pick at that are inaccurate. More like, some early wives were passed over very quickly, kind of thing.
Okay. His relationship with the Nation of Islam was more of a political than a religious move.
The Nation of Islam was arguably, and it's still around, as part of the Ali Center, education staff. I actually did some prison visits where I met some members of the Nation of Islam, and they're still around and still very active. And you're right, Dan. It's as much politics as it is religion, which is one of the reasons that eventually Muhammad left them and joined a more traditional, larger arm of Islam. He didn't want any more of the politics. He saw what it did to his friend Malcolm X. He saw what it did to the relationship between Malcolm X and Muhammad, which was very close, very close. And I can tell you that to this day, Malcolm X's oldest daughter and Lonnie Ali are best of friends to this day. But the breakup between Malcolm and Muhammad in the mid 60s was horrible. It was because of politics. And Malcolm X had issues with politics of the Nation of Islam, then got shot and killed. And by the way, Ambassador Shabazz, his first daughter, was present at that event in 1965. And it's Muhammad, especially by the time he returned to boxing, was no longer very vocal about the Nation of Islam and turned to a more traditional wing, and that became his life. And arguably in his later years, he would join a branch of Islam which is called Sufism, Sufism, which is again away. He moved into main branches, then moved away from that, and that's more ethereal. That's more almost abstract. But you know, that's where he found his peace. Other questions? If there's anything else that come to mind or you have more detailed questions, feel free to reach out to me. And Ruth can pass along emails. In fact, if you guys get the Integra newsletter, you can find my email and phone number, in there. So you can always reach out to me. I'm the main admin for the Facebook Interintelligence group. You can always message me through there. So if there's anything that comes to mind, otherwise, I encourage you to pull up If and see why Muhammad was found so much wisdom in it. And I hope you had fun. And Ruth, I hope this met your expectations for today's session.
This exceeded it, Marcel.
Yes, it was wonderful.
Yeah, it was. And I think that's why nobody has questions, because it was a great presentation. But I do have one. So you mentioned that you did get to meet him during one of the fundraisers there. Did you get to know him very well, or was it more in passing that you got to meet him kind of thing?
So Muhammad did not leave his respective homes very often in the last 6-7 years of his life. He mainly lived in Arizona with Lonnie. The dry weather was usually a little better for him, but they also had a home outside of Louisville that they maintained, and they had a home on the western shore of Michigan. But both Louisville and Michigan were not as friendly. Oh, hold on. I have somebody who wants to be part of the talk here. During work hours, I justify her presence as being one of my interns. But I ended up seeing and spending time with Muhammad normally 2 to 4 times a year. So I would not call it a close relationship, especially since it wasn't always easy to communicate with him. I got closer to Lonnie, where, she was part of the board and interacted with her at the board. And of course, every time Lonnie and Muhammad came to Louisville, Theali Center, I spent some time with her. So I got to know Lonnie much better than I did, but I interacted with Muhammad, like I said, 2 to 4 times a year over a period of about 5 years. And what I'll tell you is that the very first time I met Muhammad in person, it was actually a little bit of an accident. I knew Lonnie and Muhammad had arrived at the Ali Center for an event, but I walked into a conference room that the door was closed, and nobody told me that that's where they were going to settle in at the beginning, and just walked in and surprised them, and they surprised me. But I will tell you that it was like somebody opening the curtains at 12 p.m. and the curtains were shut and you went to bed at 7 a.m. that morning. There was just this ray of sunshine. And for those people who know me, I'm not a superstitious or mystical or particularly religious person, but there was an aura around Muhammad. And regardless of how, my thoughts about such thing, it just radiated, and I felt that passion, felt the love, and it was very, very special. And it was the same feeling every time we spent together. I've got some pictures, with Muhammad. Obviously, by the time he got into his 70s, he wasn't in his prime anymore. But I still cherish those. And we had some moments, and as much as he could, he was still a comedian and the center of attention, and always good for a laugh, until the very end.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, so I apologize. I kept you guys a little long on your call.
Oh, no, we usually run over anyway.
All right.
If anybody
Awesome.
they could, but
Well, again, the offer stands. If there are any more questions, let me know. And hope you had fun.
well, I think Dan had some. Dan, were you going to say something?
No, I just wanted to express my appreciation. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, we
Okay,
do
you're
really
very
appreciate
welcome, Dan.
And I think half our group must be watching that football game because we usually do have more than this, but it's
Not a worry, Ruth. As you know, I run the Intelligence group, and 1 month, we can have 22 people on the call, and the next month we'll have 3. So
I know, it's like that here too. So
yeah,
great.
all right,
You
awesome.
guys have a good rest of the day. Thank you again, Marcel. And
Bye-bye
I'm sure
now.
we'll be in touch. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Ciao.